I thought we talk a little bit about Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher I'm reading right now. I just read him the last couple of weeks, basically. So, his three major books, which are called Stasis, Homo Sacca, and State of Exception. And so he's like a philosopher that still, is alive. He's a little bit of a recluse. Uh,
Mhm.
I think I tried to contact him once, and we had like an email exchange because I wanted to have him on the podcast. But it turned out that he didn't want to do it. But he is like one of these super influential and super important philosophers that we have right now. I think next to Sloterdijk, he's the most important contemporary
Yeah.
philosopher.
I mean, he seems to have something to say. Uh, I don't know his work very well, but I know he was provocative during the pandemic, and that not very many people were. I think people are afraid of being provocative these days, especially if they work at universities.
Yeah,
Or so you have a choice right now between being a YouTube pandit and fighting the culture war, or being a tame and obscure intellectual in a university. And he's
yeah.
not one of those. That's what I think, or that's what I ga- gather about him.
Yeah, well, there is certainly, from what you are saying, I think in the United States and in Canada, there's a missing debate about his works. In Germany, I guess, there is a debate about him, and in Europe in general, I would think you can't talk about, Corona and, what you mentioned, the civil, the culture war without basically talking about what Agamben says to this, because like a lot of things are kind of become irrelevant if you go through his theory basically,
Mhm.
and so
Yeah, my uncle David Cayley, who is a Canadian, I know you're being very Eurocentric again, Tom. So slap, slap, slap. He wrote a great deal about Agamben and helped popularize his thinking during the COVID time. Wrote several provocative articles
yeah,
as well. Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, and so what, so he bases, a lot of his work is based on the works of Foucault and Foucault's idea of biopolitics, and he goes from there basically. And yeah, and I never had any big problems with Foucault. I like him. I like him as a writer. I like his ideas. I never had any issues with him, really. At least from the philosophical side. I always find that quite interesting.
yeah, I read Courage of Truth, which was like one of his last works, and I thought it was very good, which surprised me because I'd heard so much, venom or about him, and I thought, whoa,
Yeah,
he's a very clear writer.
yeah.
Uh, he's a very clear thinker. In any case, yeah, Courage of
And
Truth
so,
was about this idea of kind of being the fool and speaking out um, against. Against the and risking the danger of offending good opinion. So
yeah,
perhaps Agamben as well.
Agamben, yeah, Giorgio Agamben.
Sorry.
And so Foucault died 1980, and in his last, I think, and in his last book, Truth and Sexuality, in the last chapter, he outlined, the ideas of biopolitics. And I think in the 90s, Agamben wrote his books about biopolitics and the Homo Sacca and stasis and all of this. And so that was so the interesting thing is he wrote all of this before the pandemic, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But provided like a theoretical framework to understand what we went through and what was going on in our society. And David Cayley, you are What is it? Is it your? No, it's not. It's your grand cousin, no? Or what is he?
Yeah, he's a cousin. I always call him Uncle David, even though he's not my actual uncle.
Yeah,
He's my cousin.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, we always called him Uncle David.
yeah.
Um, well,
Yeah,
and he was a producer at Ideas, and he was sort of somewhat canceled, I would say, just like everybody who wasn't politically correct at the CBC, which is a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, at a certain point.
right. He had like like a very early form of a podcast, no, where he had like this, info show on television, no?
Yeah, he did very long form, deep, interviews with Ivan Illich, with George Grant, with Northrop Frye, with I think he did several interviews with. Am I not pronouncing his name correctly? How do you say his name again? What is it again?
Giorgio
This Italian
Agamben.
fellow? Agamben,
Giorgio,
yes.
no, no,
I'm
without
pretty
the
sure
T, without the T end, just Agamben.
Agamben. I'm pretty sure
Without the
he had
D.
this.
You're still having the D in there. There's no D. Agamben. Okay, so
Okay.
I don't know. I thought I can give you an overview on the ideas of Agamben.
Yes, I was going to ask you to do that. Go for it.
So because what is interesting, so I mean, for me at least, we all have, this kind of superficial understanding of what democracy is, right? And so it's like everybody has a vote, and then there are like institutions which we can form by our vote, and so on and so forth. And that's like a very superficial understanding of what democracy basically is. And what he does is to look at the underbelly of the big underbelly of democracy, how it developed, what are the aspects that are normally not talked about. And so he did this in a theoretical kind of way with some, practical and historical analysis, uh, to make it more palpable. And so what he tries to explain is that our democracy runs on kind of biopolitics. And that is the idea that, the state encroaches in every kind of way onto our personal lives, and increasingly. And this is basically part of every democracy of the polis, that the state is concerned with the well-being of its people on the most basic notion. And so that happens, and so he has like the symbolism where he says we went to, the mythology of blood in the pre-modern and pre-democratic times, to the myth of sexuality, so well-being, sexual politics, all of this, and that we and so that he calls biopolitics, that the state is concerned with our well-being. So if you look at pre-democratic democratic societies, it was more or less the sovereign was not really concerned with the well-being of its citizens, right? And so that came
Yes.
with biopolitics, and so there's an encroaching of the state into the personal lives of the people. And so you have, especially in the Greek polis, you had the idea that on one side is the state, on the other side is the family. And this polarity, the state and the family, are always in a kind of conflict with each other, because the state wants to encroach its rules on the citizens and the family wants to maintain its cohesion, let's say. And so he says, and he calls this
Yeah.
stasis. And by that he means that the civil war is always, that thing between the polis, the state, and the family, and it's always there. Sometimes it's not as visible, sometimes it's more visible, right? But it's always there. And so the idea of the civil war emerged at the same time as, the idea of democracy. And this is like a very interesting thought if you think about the culture war that we're in, because it's exactly about this. So there's the state trying to, what we are negotiating is how much the state is able and should encroach in our personal life. Should there be two bathrooms or three bathrooms or one bathroom, just as a simple example. Yeah, and then you have like two sides that kind of argue pro and against this kind of question. But from Agamben's point of view, it's relatively unnecessary or irrelevant. The left-right polarity is irrelevant because there's an underlying encroachment going on from the state onto the family in a kind of sense. And so the stasis, the civil war, the culture war is always there. And that's interesting, because we treat the culture war as something that is in opposition and threatening to our democracy, but it is actually a building block of it in Agamben's view. And again, it's like he wrote all these books before Corona, before what we called the culture war, before all of this. So it's like
Yeah.
so that's kind of interesting.
Well, I could
That,
tie in very much to the work of Ivan Illich, and I know he was very influenced by Ivan Illich
yeah,
because I know Illich's work much better than I do his. Illich spoke a lot about the fact that the Christian church got distorted into institutionalized care.
yeah,
So care became institutionalized and therefore became abstract, and therefore committed lost its sort of um, lost let's say the real care. It became a simulacrum of care, so that it actually created this cold monster of pseudo care. So Ivan Illich talks about the Samaritan in the Bible, and how the idea was that you would choose to take the Samaritan out of the ditch based on your own free choice. Whereas the distortion of that would be like you have some compulsion to care, or you have to care, or the state makes you care, or the
yeah.
state creates an ideology of care, which isn't actually real care. It's a way of avoiding real confrontation with real suffering and reality.
Yeah. Yeah,
So that's Ivan
institutionalized
Illich,
care. That's exactly what it's about.
indeed. Yeah. And Ivan Illich also, he has a strong statement. He said, if when they show pictures, when they try to make you care, you should think of that as a kind of like pray that you would never care because you are being coerced to care.
Right.
Which might be very hard for people because there's so much coercion, there's so much actual coercion, and what Chogyam Trungpa called idiot compassion around. It's just idiot compassion. It's not actual compassion. It's pseudo compassion, institutionalized care, et cetera, et cetera, and compulsion. You're supposed to do this to save lives. Whether it does or not is irrelevant. It's just that's what the society is telling you to do, and sort of forcing you into this pseudo compassion. So is that in line with his work?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, at least to some degree, because if you look at, the vaccination debate in the Corona times, it is the state, encroaching on the family life, obviously, into the personal lives, into the lives of children, and all of this. And so the debate was then, on the left and as the right, both cared, the right cared about the independence of children, and everybody should choose for themselves, and the left was like kind of having this global view. Both were caring, but this left right polarity that was just a superficial structure for a way deeper problem, namely that the state wanted to vaccinate us all. Right, and so that was this institutionalized care you were talking about.
Yeah, and you were not even a citizen if you chose to. I know if you chose to go against that. I know a doctor who had to leave the European Union and lost his license because he didn't feel that the vaccination program. He felt that it was doing more harm than good, and perhaps he was right. But there was this, whether or not he was right or not is in a way irrelevant. The fact that he wasn't allowed to have an opinion. That's when the state is encroaching,
Right. Exactly.
on the family. When we're not allowed to even, have a view on the subject, it's just fiat, right?
Yeah. And so another example,
So,
and I found that as a German, I found that very interesting because Agamben argues that that historians always had the problem to explain how a more or less democratic country, Germany before the 30s, became practically fascist overnight for 13, 14 years, and then overnight
hmm.
became democratic again. So it's like, how do you explain this? And so it's like because you can't really say, oh no, the people became just evil, and collectively evil, um, and then they become normal and good again. And so the question was, how do you explain this? And so he was looking at the Nürnberger doctors, trials, where all these Nazi doctors were under trial. That was a little bit later. I think that was 46. And because, the same argument, how can that be that all these internationally renowned doctors would suddenly become the most cruel people on the fucking planet? So what is the rationale behind this? What is the explanation? And so Agamben went through all these documents and files and the trial, and he saw that just at the beginning of the trial, the judges, which were all American, had the problem with the baseline defense of the Nazi doctors, which were basically saying, listen, you were all doing this before us. You were doing, all the experimentation. We got this from you. It was at that time common sense that the state, and especially the Americans, would do experiments on prisoners. Yeah. So that was no, that
Oh,
was
right.
no, that was nothing that fell out of the thin air. It was a common practice, and it was even after Second World War in the United States. It was a practice, testing people, populations on nuclear radiation and stuff. So this practice, had some background, and so the American judges had to sort out what kind of legal way you have to distinguish the different ways you could approach this kind of thing, because the difference obviously
Oh,
was that,
that's interesting.
because the problem
Well, I
the
was
difference.
listening. Sorry, I've been Go ahead.
No, just finishing up. It's like the difference obviously was that the prisoners, would get like a prison reduction when they would comply to the experiments, and so that was obviously something that the German prisoners did not get. So it was like like a.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I don't know if you've heard some of the conspiracy theories around, JFK. One is that I think Lee Harvey Oswald was being tested on LSD to become a killer, right?
yeah,
Um, and not only were the Americans doing that kind of thing with LSD, they were testing human beings. They were actually, applying them to war, and not to mention the various experiments with shock therapy and all that, which were horrendously cruel. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the Nazis got many of their ideas from the more apparently benevolent Americans, or
yeah. And so you see
just the cutting edge medical establishment, right, at that time. Sometimes the cutting edge is the worst. They're the
right,
worst people.
yeah. Yeah, and
They're
the
not
same
always the
goes.
most.
So when the state encroaches, again, as an example, how the state encroaches on people, and Agamben argues the same happened with the concentration camps, because there also the concentration camp just manifested out of thin air. It was like, I think it was invented by the Brits in terms of the South American Boer Wars. No, South African. And
Yeah,
so they
I've heard
created
that.
the first concentration camp, and then they were like 1856, and through the next 80 years, different countries employed different concentration camps to put their political opponents into some into a lager, into a camp. And so the same, and so especially in Germany at that time in the 20s, the concentration camp was employed by the social democrats to concentrate the communists together, so that it had already a kind of history that the Germans took and put into an overdrive, let's say. And so it's like,
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's another thing that Ivan Illich talks a lot about is counterproductivity. You have all the best intentions in the world, and you end up inventing a monstrous thing. Like, how many millions of people died in camps in the 20th century, and there still
yeah,
have these concentration camps in North Korea. They still exist, and in China, just they put people in camps and they call it
yeah,
education. They call
right,
it re-education. It's they call it the most banal thing, the most benevolent thing, right? We're going to help these people, right? Again, it's this question of false compassion. It's this question
right,
of pseudo care. It's this question of fake help,
yeah,
right? And we can look at that and think, oh no, all these people, at during the COVID times, they had all the best intentions. They were trying to save lives, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe they were, but also maybe they were on the verge of creating something monstrous. Who
right.
knows what could have happened if or what could happen in the future with another lockdown. Probably will happen, where the state encroaches on people's lives to such an intense degree again. And so all the kind of seeds for that to happen are there.
Yeah, it's exactly, because for Agamben, the camp in German, das Lager, is the quintessential symbol of modernity, right? And so it's so interesting. So it's so interesting that you mentioned, again, COVID, because in a kind of sense, that's in inverse camp, because people were, put into their houses, and they were like, and I mean, like, at least in Germany, there were like calls to create a camp for the unvaccinated. And so you have, this motive running through, this whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that, yeah, I think maybe. Maybe because I don't know why didn't that happen? I mean, it did happen and it didn't happen. I guess it could have been a lot worse. I wonder again. I also use the Marshall McLuhan analysis. Is that it's really hard to control people when you have this kind of media that exists today, which is so which is the cool kind of media, which is so distracting, right? So
Yeah,
it's hard to whip everybody into an intense frenzy, intense murderous frenzy, like you could in the 20th century with radio, basically as being a hot form of media. You could hypnotize entire populations, whereas today there's so many different kinds of media that are and there's so much contradiction and there's so much chaos that I think in some way that keeps us somewhat safe. It also has its own kind of danger, but I don't know if you're following that. There's a way in which it prevents some forms of totalitarian, you know, uh, activity from happening, while it does create other forms of sort of soft totalitarianism. I
yeah.
don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, when you read Agamben, is that you get a sense for the thing, that for the idea that the state or nation states, or even continents like Europe, are like big organisms, and they follow their own rules. And it's like and it's a weird thing, because it seems to be out of our control, but it's self-regulating. And that's the other point, that because you're talking about totalitarianism and the hard and the soft kind of way, because the other aspect, apart from stasis, which again is like the civil war, the embedded civil war within democracy. Another, foundation and of democracy is the state of exception, the emergency state. That which we kind of saw with COVID, where the state assumes the role of the totalitarian, sovereign, and does that for a particularly short time, a couple of months, and that
Yeah,
happens.
you talked about that before. It's built into democracy, right?
Yes, exactly.
Democracy is not this free system. It's a system that requires the occasional state of emergency to kind of keep it in check.
Yeah, and to rebalance it in a kind of way, and so, but it's not that visible, because from to the superficial observer, it seems as if the state of exception, the state of emergency, is something that happens in resistance or in opposition to democracy, but it is not. It is inbuilt, and what Agamben does is he shows through the centuries and through the decades how this state of exception always appears and always kind of stabilizes the good times when everything works well. And so he talks about Lincoln and the time when he acted as a quasi-emperor for a couple of months, because the United States needed a time to readjust, the democratic process for the whole country. And so then you had, decades later, you had, the wars on terror and again, Corona. But it's like these phases are not. And so personally, it helped me a lot to understand that, these Corona kind of injunctions and these kind of ways to, this state of exception is actually something that enables democracy. And that is,
But also, it's always based on untruths, So it's always based on lies, right? Because everybody knows that what people were saying during COVID was a lie, by now. People know that. And
right.
people knew it at the time, right?
Yeah.
People knew that what Fauci was saying and other people they were all lies. But people said, "Oh, it's okay because this is an emergency, so we're going to dispense with the truth for a little while and just follow along and follow in line and do that for a while, and then we'll go back to freedom later." And people were kind of okay with that.
Yeah.
It seems to, I guess, because maybe just people have no real, in a way, people don't have a choice. There's not that many thinking people in the world. People are mostly, I mean, they're thinking in their intimate world, but they're not really, most people are not really, aware of the larger pictures in any depth. They're just getting shallow messages from various shallow sources. So it's quite easy just to dispense with the truth for a little while.
Yeah.
To get something done that somebody thinks is necessary,
Yeah.
And it doesn't.
So, but if
they're wrong. Yeah.
So, like, building on what you just said, because just to bring it a little bit together, so you have like basically democracy, and then you have like it's like a triangle, and you have the stasis, you have the state of exception, you have biopolitics, right? And so that creates a tension. And it's kind of stable, because I mean you have the state tries to encroach on you. You have the civil war that's resulting, and to stabilize it again you have the state of exception. And now comes the interesting part, because Agamben talks a lot about the Solonic law of the Greeks, right? Because you say you can't escape this. And so the Solonic law was a law that obligated every citizen to partake in the civil war. So if you wanted to be a citizen within the polis, right, you had to draw the sword, and if you're not, you were expelled out of the civilization. So it was.
Does that mean metaphorically today that we have to pick sides or something? Is that the point?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because in Japan, for example, now there is if you have too much shame, if because you fucked up your work or your marriage or whatever, you can still leave the society. There's like there are even like businesses that provide that, and I've read this, and I was like, oh no, that can't be, and then I looked it up, and it's even on Wikipedia. So it's a kind of tradition in Japan that if you have too much
Uh-huh.
shame, you can leave the grid, the civilization behind and live off the grid, but you're not a citizen anymore, right? And so the idea
Okay.
is
Oh,
that
so it's a kind of exile or something. It's kind
yeah,
of
yeah, it's
like the ultimate punishment was exile. It's like the way Socrates took poison because he didn't once you leave, then you're out of the world, right? So
right.
eh, yeah.
Right. And so you had to partake. And in a kind of way, the argument, and so Agamben explains the Solonic law in terms that, well, the Greeks, they didn't saw the civil war as something bad. They saw it as an opportunity to come together. So that's a complete shift in perspective, right? So because the civil war is always there, the goal is not really that one side wins. The goal is that everybody comes together. And that was the
Well, that's
idea of
close.
this.
That's also a scapegoat thing too. Everybody comes together to kill the scapegoat. Um, Again, it reminds me of Gerard because what happens is the tension within a society builds up and builds up and builds up till you have the war of all against all. And then the way you unite people is to get them to find a common enemy. And once you have a common enemy, then you conquer that enemy, then you can go back to your ordinary life. And that was the function of the scapegoat. So I think that tension that you're talking about is pretty well described. In Girard, it's just yes, there is a civil war that develops, right? Because like there's this intense internal conflict that we have, brother against brother, and that rises up and then causes war, and then there's there has to be some way to diffuse
Yeah,
that tension. So I guess democracy is a way of sort of diffusing um, the tension so that people don't just kind of kill each other.
yeah,
Instead, they vote. They
yeah.
vote
Well,
for a couple of corpses. Trump and Biden. Near corpse-like figures. It's a strange mummery. I don't know. Mummery is like it's like there's puppets, these grotesque puppets that are, symbolic representations of this civil war. I don't know if I explained that. It was just an image I had when I saw this sort of image of Biden and Trump, debating.
yeah. Let me just add some more because you mentioned Girard, and I was thinking a lot about Girard in this context because Agamben offers an alternative method, and it's in a kind of
Hmm.
way it's an implicit critique of Girard because he said in that the Greeks had a different conflict resolution. And the conflict resolution was not that you kill a scapegoat. The conflict resolution in civil war was in ancient Greek times that you would choose arbitrarily, five members of different stratas of the society, of the two sides. Imagine like five guys from the left or five people and five people from the right, right? And
Hmm.
they would come together and create a new family or
Hmm.
create new
Interesting.
families. And so that was the ideal of the Greeks and the method to overcome the tension. And it's like
Well, there
It's
was also the pharmacon, and that was the idea of Girard. Is the Greeks would they choose the pharmacon, and the pharmacon was the scapegoat. By definition, they'd take an older person or a slave, and they push them off the cliff.
yeah, yeah. I'm not saying
Um,
that is wrong. I'm
yeah,
saying there's
maybe
an
maybe it's not. I
alternative.
don't know if it's a critique. I just think it's another aspect of the same kind of dynamic. You mix the two. Um,
No, it's a different methodology. No, it's like I think there are different. That's all I'm trying to say. That there are different, historically speaking, different kinds of conflict resolution within. When the tribes are at war with each other. One is certainly you make a scapegoat, and I think there's history there's enough ample evidence to show that. But what I liked about Agamben's idea, it's like we are not it's like we are a little bit more smarter than to just kill people. We devised other methods of conflict resolution and to bring, 5 or 10 people from different tribes together to create a new family and as a symbol for the new peace and and as an indicator of the peace and the possibility of peace. And so
yeah.
I found that also interesting.
But
That
I think you're misunderstanding Gerard because he says that the scapegoat mechanism becomes more and more transparent over time as they find different methods like democracy for dealing with it. So it's always there, but the method that you're talking about again would be one method to diffuse the scapegoat mechanism, which is like at the bottom of civilization in the most ancient civilizations, right? And as we become more and more civilized, the scapegoat mechanism becomes more transparent. So we have things like democracy and yeah, and voting and police and armies and these kind of things to keep that spontaneous violence from erupting. That's more. So I wouldn't. Again, I don't think that it's a critique of Girard. I think it's in line with Girard's theory because by the time we got to the ancient Greeks, there was some sophistication, and developing,
I don't know if the
through
family,
literacy.
the families that would come together would signify being the scapegoat. That's the only problem
Oh,
that
I
I have.
didn't. No, I'm saying exactly that. I'm saying they're not the scapegoat. See, because the scapegoat becomes more transparent, so people don't believe in the scapegoat mechanism. The more as you go through history, less and less. It's always there, but it gets diffused. So I'm saying yes, yeah, that's exactly right. That people found different ways of dealing with the scapegoat
Right.
mechanism. Not and just
No,
described
but
one of them,
no,
and
no, no. They find different
that doesn't
ways to the
contradict.
scapegoat mechanism because bringing people together is not a scapegoat mechanism. That's my
No, it's
only.
the opposite of escapism. So I'm
Right.
agreeing with you, and
Right.
Gerard would agree with you as well. Because he sees the progress away from the scapegoat
Right.
mechanism as we go through history, right?
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, so but the
but
idea still is, that you had to partake on the civil war in a kind of and to you had to enact within the tensions that the stasis and the state of exception burdens upon you. And you can't the more and the more willing its citizens are to partake on this conflict, the faster the conflict finds its resolution. And that's an interesting thought, that the idea is not the destruction of the other side, but the coming together in a kind of way. And I think we sometimes forget this, that is, it's not about, that the left should vanish or that the right should vanish, because we need every voice on the political spectrum to be truly democratic, right? It's like because
yeah,
yeah, because especially the voices from the extreme left and the extreme right are necessary, because without them there would nobody there to formulate and express the wild ideas, and debate it and maybe discard it, and maybe it's like it needs all the voices, every voice at the function, and
sure.
it makes no
Um,
sense to try to get rid of the conservatives, let's say.
yeah, I find myself as I age feeling more closer to like small c conservative point of view and distrustful of, and I don't think that's distrustful of radical ideologies of any kind. And I don't think that's because, I'm any smarter than I used to be. I think it's just because of my age and temperament. And I think often people's political perspectives are temperamental, and I often find myself able to sort of inhabit, different political perspectives,
Yeah,
just, travel within them and go, oh yeah, I kind of get that.
yeah,
Like I was listening to this radical guy from the 60s talking about, the Black Panthers, and I can get that a little bit. And then I can go over to a sort of neoconservative. Yeah, I kind of get that. Um, I wonder I wonder if we have to sort of artificially, pick sides or take a stand in some kind of way, just not based on any kind of absolute truth, but just to sort of mishmash your perspectives and say, okay, so here I'm going to take a stand. Like I wonder if we need to take a stand, or if I personally need to take a stand on certain things, because I often find myself not wanting to take a stand, wanting to sort of, you know, have this detached perspective and watch the whole theater, play itself out without taking it all taking it seriously enough. So,
I mean, that's a good
that's
question that I think.
I've been something I've been thinking about. Should I just take a stand about something, even if I'm not 100% sure about it? Because it's better to do that than not take a stand at all.
I think, that's an absolute important question, and I think, it's it's how do I say this? I mean, to take a stand, but not to be overly attached. I think
Exactly.
there's a middle way to that, but I think, and that's what the Solonic law is kind of, or was kind of implying, or requiring of its citizens, that they take a stand,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
Otherwise, you forfeit your right as a citizen.
and also you take a stand based on the people you trust, So, when I hear Robert Kennedy speak, he sounds more like a man of integrity to me than the other guys, and he's talking about biopolitics, and he's talking about things that nobody has any guts to talk about. So I have a certain resonance with him, whereas I know people who think he's a complete nutcase.
Yeah.
And maybe they're right, but yeah, maybe they are. Maybe he is a nutcase, but sometimes you have to go by gut instinct and intuition and take a stand, knowing that you're not really you're not. It's not like you're righteous about it or anything, because why be righteous about stuff? I mean.
Yeah,
Again, this is my
what you
temperament as well. I think it's my temperament that makes me this way, not because I'm not that I would even want other people to be as sort of detached as I am.
Yeah, what's interesting, because it's like, I mean, this is just anecdotal, because it's personal, and I think, you start somewhere. I started somewhere in my political, bias, in my political affiliation, and let's call it left. It's like all the leftist ideas, and the older I got, the more I started to understand, the different voices towards the right. That doesn't mean that I'm right. I'm still, my baseline function is still, equal rights for everybody, and protect, protect the environment, and all of these kind of leftist ideas. But
Yeah,
so yesterday I was just thinking about, this crazy thing that the Americans insist on having guns, for the protections against the government. And I was like always kind of annoyed by, why are the Americans so stupid? But, from their point of view, and it's like, I think, like, from the European
yeah,
mind, it's utterly incomprehensible that, the state is the only institution that can exert power. And the American idea as well, they should not be. well, I should have the right to protect myself against the state. That's a principle. And out of that principle, the idea of having, guns in your house, it's not, I wouldn't have guns in my house, but I kind of understand the rationale behind it. And that's what I mean. It's like
Mhm.
the older you get, the more you
Yeah.
understand, these kinds of weird or not weird, political.
Well, it would not be, or if you were in the middle of Texas somewhere, it would be weird how Europeans are so cowed towards the state, right? How Europeans are just so, you know, such sheep when it comes to the state.
Right,
That's how people from Texas feel about Europeans. They're all just sheep, and they're just gonna let the state be their mother for them, right? And
right,
they don't even speak to their neighbor. So yeah, yes, you can understand that point of view, and I feel the same way. I feel like I have a basically left operating system, which
right,
was implanted in me because of my background, because I had a lefty mom, and on the lesbian side, and who was always talking about indigenous people and the suffering of the world. So I just automatically had that perspective. But but then it's a very strange feeling for me to be listening to people on the right and kind of agreeing with them, half the
right. Or
time.
at least understanding them.
It's a strange, it's there's agreeing with them, and a lot of the time these days, like I was listening to this woman talk about schools, and how fucked up the school system is, and how you going back to the old fashioned grammar school, where your kids know where their place is, and it was like it made total sense. The kids are happier, they have limits, they have behavioral codes, and today we're just putting our children in this meat factory, and nobody, and they're all unhappy. And anyway, I feel like I'm actually agreeing with many people in the sort of small C conservative camp, not even just has as an experiment. you know,
Yeah,
um, that's where I'm still very uncomfortable, right? I would be uncomfortable saying that because my milieu is not receptive to that. My entire background and past and history
yeah. And the
is
issue
not
and the problem
receptive
is
to
like,
that.
what kind of perspective and what kind of stand, do you take? Like, where do you put your flag in if you are able to understand the whole spectrum? It's like what case do you want to make? And that's a way more complex question than, like a lefty or like a conservative. They're just by default that, and they're not able to have an alternative perspective. So I mean, like when you're talking about taking a stand for something and voicing something, if you understand, all the voices, like what kind of stand do you take then?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, who do you like, especially since if you take a stand, people will start to think that you're deplorable. I work as a teacher, and I go to schools and I hear teachers talk, and teachers have a uniform, almost entirely uniform left-wing perspective about everything from Palestine to you know, to environment, to everything. And I just hear the same repetitive blah, blah, blah over and over again. And I just sit there and I nod my head, because I know that if I don't nod my head, or if I try to argue with them, they're going to think I'm a deplorable human being, and probably, ostracize me from the herd. So that's what you're up against,
Right.
if you're in society. I can talk on a podcast with you because we're a bunch of outsider, lunatics, compared to the mainstream.
Yeah, well, I
It's
mean,
just
to bring it all together, Andrew, I think, talking about Agamben, and it's like if there would be like a more global understanding, and I know that's asking a lot, but it's like a deeper understanding of how democracy works. That the civil war is always part of it. That conflict is always part of it. That emergency states are always part of it, and that the state wants to encroach, he wants to care, which is not entirely bad because it substituted, that we're just killing each other. Right. And so it's like
Mhm.
it's a welfare state and it's a welfare endeavor. And so if we understand this, then we don't have to weaponize it. We don't have to fight, against, for the Maginot line that separates left and right, but to understand that that kind of all belongs together. And then we can have some understanding of how we actually can use the system, to that it works to our benefits, so we don't have to you know dig our
Does it
foxholes
work?
of political ideology, and
Yeah.
it's about to come to, it's like the idea is that we come together. That's the idea, and it sounds so cliche, John Lennon, 70s Beatles, bed-in style, but it's like, there's some truth to that too. And that's, the point I'm
Yeah,
trying to
no,
make.
but yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, maybe the word's going to get better, maybe it's going to get worse, but I don't know. I have a very anarchistic kind of streak in me. I don't want to believe in whatever good news or bad news is being shoveled down my throat.
Yeah, but then you are
I
again
want to
in the
go.
foxhole. I'm
I want to
talking
go a
about a
little bit
deeper
deeper. I
perspective.
want to be deeper than that. What? I want to go
Yeah, but then you
deeper.
are I'm not talking about, the opinions. I'm talking, about the deeper processes and the appreciation of, the deeper processes. And I think that's, that it's not about if you're left or right on what kind of side of the aisle you stand. It's not the point. It's a superficial analysis to go at a problem from the right or left side. That's not the point. The
And what
point
if
is,
sometimes you need to go on the right because the left is overreaching, and then sometimes you need to go on the left because the right is overreaching, and
right,
so you always need to adjust your view, and sometimes you have to get the fuck out of the center because it's just a land of mediocrity, and
right.
have a radically different perspective. So it's like I think you always have. It's like sailing, you always have to adjust your sails
Well, that's the
based on
Sonic law. Yes, that's your obligation. Exactly.
the way the wind is blowing, not saying, oh, we're just going to go that way. No, forget it. You have to be very flexible. I think
Yeah.
people find their hill to die on too easily. Like, okay, this is my belief. I'm a Marxist, or this is my belief. I'm a Hegelian, or this is my belief. I'm a whatever, and they just stick with that forever, and they're blind to everything else. So
Yeah.
so yeah, we have to sort of adjust.